Good morning. Thank you so much, Keith. I'm Melissa, and it is a pleasure to be with you. Like Keith, I was asked to share a bit about my personal journey and beliefs. And like Keith, perhaps there isn't much of a journey because I too am a cradle Unitarian Universalist. Not completely sure who planned this, but in other ways, I think there are lots of differences that I think will be hopefully a good generative tension this morning. I will say that preparing this week has been harder than I expected it to be. Not only because I haven't quite shifted back into the part of my brain where summer break is over and I have to do things in public. But because it turns out that in my 20s, in my 30s, even in my 40s, being asked to tell you what I believe would have been mostly an act of translation. In other words, I would be pretty clear about what I believed, and I would just need to find the right words to explain it to you. But now in my 50s, sharing what I believe is less an act of self-expression and more that hard work of self-discovery. I had to ask myself a bit this week, what is it I believe? Because life, of course, does to us what it does. Sandra Kay is, for all of us who know her, the most relentlessly optimistic and positive person, and something shifted to hear the loss that she has experienced. 5 decades of loss, of grief, of suffering, of joy, of triumph, of transformation, of agony and elation have mostly not hardened my beliefs into kind of immovable granite beneath my feet, but transformed them, really splintered them into pebbles that if I hold my beliefs too tightly are likely to fall through the cracks of my fingers. Now, I have grown even more certain, more sure of some beliefs. I believe that my husband makes the best gumbo in the world. I believe that my daughters are the most extraordinary and interesting creatures on the planet. But for most things, the primary wisdom of aging for me has been that whatever I hold to be true today is likely to maybe undergo at least a bit of revision as a result of experience tomorrow, next year, or in 10 years. But what else could you expect a lifelong Unitarian Universalist to say, after all? I mean, I was raised in Charlottesville, Virginia, in an interracial family less than a decade after the Loving v. Virginia decision. So it isn't really that surprising that my mother, who is here with us today, chose the Unitarian Universalist congregation for our family. Where else were we going to go? And I am, in that sense, Unitarian through and through. I believe in the interdependent web of life and will certainly usher a spider out of my home under a glass with a little piece of paper on the bottom. I've turned over my backyard to a flock of chickens and turned over my couch to a pack of dogs. I believe in both the power of independent and collaborative processes to search for truth. I've spent more than 25 years as a college professor being paid to do exactly that. And having been raised in a congregation named, at least previously, for Thomas Jefferson, I believe in the inherent worth and dignity of all persons, and I believe that all persons are inherently equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the right to pursue self-fulfillment and human flourishing. I believe that we establish governments among ourselves in order to protect these rights, and I believe that governments derive their just powers from consent of the governed. Being a UU parent, I believe in accurate common sense, life-affirming, lifespan sex education our whole lives, and I believe in gender and reproductive justice. And I suppose, like Keith, I actually believe in UUism, which means for me, as a political scientist, raised in the Thomas Jefferson congregation, that I believe in the messy, imperfect, disappointing, halting work of democracy as the best way to ultimately get to our collective goals. And I'm just a Southern Black Christian lady. I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus Christ. I count Jesus among my best friends and closest confidants. We talk daily, we argue regularly, we laugh and cry. And in the past 2 years, I swear we have been arm wrestling. And arm wrestling with Jesus is heady, exhausting work. This, I imagine, is the moment when I will lose at least some of you and maybe many of you. I understand that the declaration of my personal intimacy with Jesus is, let's call it in TikTok language, a red flag. I know that my buddy, Jesus, has been used as a bludgeon against many, a weapon of cruelty and harm. And saying that I am Christian may sound like judgment or even derision. It might signal to you that I have a set of personal or political or social commitments profoundly misaligned with your own. For others, it might just sound like I announced, I believe in a flat world, and if your arm is broken, let me pray on it, girl. For many, Christianity is little more than a kind of anti-intellectual superstition, best relegated to an era before the Enlightenment. And I will say, fair, understood, for my Gen Z, valid. Oh God, look at the look. And still I believe. And to be clear, I don't believe that Jesus is like a lucky talisman to be deployed on game day. And I don't believe that prayer is a magical incantation for personal gain. In the evidence-based world, I've tried it. I haven't won the lottery, even though we've been talking. And maybe this is in part because not only am I a lifelong Unitarian, but I'm also an empirical social scientist. In my professional life, the pursuit of truth is pretty clearly defined by the liminal constraints of my discipline. If I want to know if something is true, I have tools to make that determination. I draw a random sample, I plot the relationship between the variables, I determine the strength and direction of those variables, and I know how to figure out with reasonable certainty whether or not the variable relationships are in fact significant. Look, I became a social scientist because I find that certainty comforting, just like a little blanket, Is it true? I don't know. Is it within 2 standard deviations? So I'm a UU, I'm a social scientist, and I'm a little old Black lady who hangs out with Jesus. And my Christianity, while not a talisman, is an ongoing relationship rooted in the past and connected to my present. You see, I am descended in direct, traceable, and geographically proximate line to enslaved Africans who toiled without freedom or wages or autonomy on the stolen lands of indigenous people for centuries. My people, my actual people, my ancestors, my relatives, my grands and my greats were shoved into the dark holes of ships, and their bodies were broken by brutality and labor, and their joys and their sorrows were disregarded, and their genius was stolen, and their children were sold to pay debts, and their lives were mortgaged to pay for farm equipment, and their lives were reduced to ledger entries, and they were acquired and traded and leased and disposed of, and all of it happened right round here. Right here, their suffering, their labors, their reproduction, their agricultural genius, their scientific innovations, their culinary originality, their artistic brilliance, their strategic resistance, and their unflagging commitment to democratic self-governance built the most extraordinary, wealthy, powerful nation on earth. my people, my actual people, my relatives, my greats and my grands. And it was here, in this land of suffering and of creation, where my people had a definitive encounter with the divine. Now, I want to be clear. I am not claiming that Christianity is everyone's definitive encounter with the divine. I'm not even necessarily making an argument that the divine is true, capital T, empirical evidence, within 2 standard deviations. I'm making a claim about the ways that Black Christian traditions emerged from a particular theology and set of practices of enslaved people in the American South. Because here, my people met an unmarried teenager, made pregnant by a figure so powerful that it would be impossible for us to understand their encounter as anything other than coercive. And here, my people met her child, who was born into poverty under the threat of massacre, but whose birth nonetheless was celebrated by his family and his community. And here my people learned the story of how that poor child, born to that teen mother, grew into a radical leader of a small resistance movement that affirmed the humanity and equality of the disenfranchised, the impoverished, and the reviled. And here my people learned the story of how that young radical leader was brutally lynched by a government that hoped to terrorize the followers of this young man and to silence their nascent movement for equality. And here, my people, my actual people, my relatives, my greats and my grands, learned that the story did not end after that act of state violence. Here, my people learned that in defiance of all science, all rationality, all reason, a miracle happened. A miracle that was witnessed by women and then later affirmed by male friends. Here, my people met Jesus, whose life continued after death, whose love persisted across time and space, and whose movement promised liberation for all. See, I'm a Christian not because I have tangible empirical evidence of the veracity of that story. I mean, I don't know. Sounds like a wild-ass story to me. But I'm a Christian because for my people, my actual people, my ancestors, my relatives, my greats and my grands, this story is the definitive encounter with the divine. And they passed it on in songs, in whispers, in the seeds they braided in our hair, and in our steadfast belief in our humanity, even when there was no empirical evidence of that either. See, some of my people knew only intergenerational chattel bondage. Some anticipated only intergenerational chattel bondage for their children and grandchildren. All were abused. But I stand in open mouth awe of my people because despite that undeniable empirical reality, they built families. They bothered to love the children that they bore. They built whole communities. My people who were denied education wrote poetry. I mean, why? Why? Why would you care about the quality of your work when your labor brings nothing to your own wealth? They created humor so biting that the people in power don't even realize they're the punchline of the joke. They invented and created and established modern architecture and agriculture and cutting-edge technology. They loved and they survived. They laughed and they prayed and they believed in democracy anyway. The first thing they did on the advent of freedom was run for office. Who does that? And it suggests to me, in these breadcrumbs, that faith is, in fact, for me, something not just bigger than myself, but also something made up of more than just people. To borrow Keith, I just saw that. That if I'm alone here on the planet with y'all, good night. I mean, I like y'all, but mercy. As my husband, who is a activist and organizer, sometimes says, or maybe I say it to him, maybe it's me, who knows, it's been a while. It's something like, the people are easy to love in theory, but in practice, like, have you met the people? So for me, my Christianity, my faith is and exercise an intellectual humility. And it's a practice of unrepentant ancestor worship. It's a reminder that not everything worth knowing is in a book or even beside Walden's Pond. I wear a cross to remind me of the brutal power and violence of the state, and that the brutal violence and power of the state need not be the last word. My Christian faith does not make me more concrete, it makes me more curious. It doesn't close me off, it shatters me into openness. My faith is not a list of rights and wrongs, do's and don'ts. For me, it's actually a reminder that we don't have all the answers and we barely even know the right questions to ask. My Christian faith is interwoven with my Unitarian Universalism. It's a reminder that even as I search for truth and meaning, I do not know, cannot know, and will not know all things, no matter how earnest my search. I'm a Christian, Unitarian, Universalist, because believing in the interdependent web of life requires that I take seriously my greats and my grands, that I can't simply dismiss them as less evolved, superstitious. Neither my Christianity nor my commitment to Unitarian Universalism gives me all the answers. Neither is fully soothing. Neither is a cloak to toss over complexity. But together, the hand-stitched quilt of beliefs is a connection and a call to action. It is here, in my Christian Unitarian Universalism, where I find the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen. Thank you.